Hello everyone and welcome back. Today is our second lecture on our World War II unit. I want to remind you that this unit is a little bit different. You do need to be taking notes in a notebook. There are no fill-in-the-blank notes to follow along with. So I just ask that, number one, do not try to write down everything I say. Please make sure that you are just focusing on what you consider to be the major points that I'm giving. Also summarize it in your own words. We talked a little bit in my kind of tip video on taking notes like this about creating shorthand and abbreviating where necessary, so you're not writing out the full names of places and people, countries. Instead of writing out Mussolini every time, just big old capital M there. You'll know at the end what that means. Anyways, I just wanted to remind you that's kind of the expectation, that you are taking notes in your own notebooks as we go along. Today is one of the most interesting lectures I think I will give you all year long, and we're going to be talking about the rise of the dictators in the 1930s. Europe is going to be the home to a new type of government called fascism. And of course, fascism is something that is going to take root in first Italy, but also Spain, and then finally, of course, Germany. And the rise of Adolf Hitler will be our main topic today. But I think this is also a very timely unit because I think you are going to see that a lot of the motivations that led to the rise of fascism are frankly reappearing in today's society. The desire to have strong-arm leadership and frankly coupled with xenophobic concerns throughout the world. We've actually seen fascist parties rise up in the modern world. For instance, in Greece, there is an openly fascist political party that has actually gained seats in their parliament system. So this is an issue that is not just ancient history. This is something that we still need to learn, the evils of fascism, why they came about, and we have to avoid the same pitfalls that our previous generations have gone through. These are some dangerous things that can ultimately lead to major conflict between nations. And I would also remind you that I never want to glorify war. War is something that should be avoided at all costs. World War II, it got to the point where fighting did need to take place. I mean, Hitler had to be stopped. We're going to look at how things got so horribly out of control that it led to the most devastating war in human history. I will also warn you that if we allow things like this to occur again, that the next war would be even more devastating because now that nuclear proliferation, now that there's a dozen countries in the world with nuclear weapons, if a world war were to break out, it would be nothing like what we're talking about now, and it would be much more devastating with very high civilian loss rate. And so this stuff's important to make sure that we avoid these pitfalls. So enough of my soapbox. Let's go ahead and turn back to the notes, and we are going to begin today on our path towards describing fascism by, first of all, defining some very important terms that all of them are somewhat unique and different, but there's some overlap. And often these words get thrown around and frankly used synonymously where frankly they necessarily shouldn't. So I did want to kind of remind you about some of these and explain what led to all of these rising up in the 1930s. So just again, kind of our background here. This is still the Great Depression, okay? Economic troubles throughout the world. The Great Depression did not just affect America. This was something that affected global society. We talked about how tariffs had really slowed down global trade, and countries are really feeling that pinch, especially countries like Germany, which are owing literally over $10 billion to France for their war costs. So that is kind of the setting in which leads to such radical political and economic ideas. I kind of always mention to my classes that when countries face very extreme and radical situations, they often turn to radical leadership. Sometimes that's it's just something to be concerned about, that we don't overreact in certain situations. So instead of talking in generics, let's get down to it. The first term I want to describe is actually one we've already discussed in our class before. We discussed this with the rise of World War I, and that is nationalism. Now, nationalism is separate from patriotism, right? There's nothing wrong with patriotism, having pride in one's country. I always think of the Olympics, everybody waving their flag. It's great. It's a celebration, right? Nationalism goes a step further than that. It's not just about pride and loyalty to one's own country, but it's a belief in the superiority of one's country. And again, that idea alone may not be a bad thing. You can think, hey, America is the greatest country in the world. But if that belief goes to the extent where one nation can then kind of force its will onto another nation, that's where you start to run into problems. And that is really the extent of nationalism. This belief in superiority over one's nation, and what that eventually turns into with nationalism is basically one nation dictating what another nation should do, or frankly just invading that country. And we're going to see that with Germany and Poland next time. The next term, excuse me. The next term is authoritarianism. And of course, you can see the root word there, authority. This is a government that is characterized by absolute and unquestioning blind allegiance to authority. Now, there are many authoritarian nations today. I would suggest that China is an authoritarian nation. They have one political party that can exist there. I would suggest that Russia is an authoritarian state as well. But the government in an authoritarian state can dictate, certain areas of society, what they must do, and of course there's a lot of corruption that comes with that. But we're saying at the basis of authoritarianism it's all about force. Okay, the government is forcing people to do one thing or another. Now, in an authoritarian country, if you go to China or Russia today, you still have, you can still do certain things. I've been to China, right? I visited China. I visited, a lot of their landmarks, and it's a beautiful country. But it was still an authoritarian state. There were certain things that I could not do there, including things like criticize the government, where, here in America, we could, do that. So, in an authoritarian state, it's not complete control over people, but there is a certain amount of control over people. Now, complete control, that kind of government, we would refer to as a totalitarian society. And when we're talking about the 1930s nations in Europe, that's really what we're referring to. In Russia with Joseph Stalin, in Germany with Adolf Hitler, Italy with Benito Mussolini. A totalitarian state where they control they have total authority over society. They control all aspects of both public and private life, wherever possible. In Germany, they're literally dictating who you cannot marry. Okay, that is total control over your life. In Soviet Russia, they were dictating, what your job had to be. You didn't have a say in that. You didn't have a choice. You were told what you would do for a living, where you would live. That is total control over one's life, and that's a characteristic of totalitarianism. Excuse me, hopefully that doesn't continue. Now, in both totalitarian governments and authoritarian governments, you often have the emergence of dictatorships, okay, where you have a singular ruler with total control over a country. And usually that control is obtained by force. We'll see that that's not always the case. In fact, Adolf Hitler, he definitely used force to try and gain control, but ultimately they voted for Hitler to have power. So we'll see that later on. But just understand that term dictatorship is always present in a totalitarian society. There's always a singular leader, with blind obedience to that leader. In authoritarian states, there's often a dictator, but that's not a requirement for an authoritarian state. This all is kind of going to be combined in the 1930s to introduce a new type of government called fascism. Fascism comes from the Latin word fasces, and I've included a picture there. This is an ancient term from ancient Rome, which the fasces was basically a bundle of sticks with an axe head attached to the top that was given to the leader of Rome to symbolize the power that they had, the power to not only beat someone, but also to execute them. It is a symbol of power. So the reason that that fascism is called this is because the man who originally created this was Benito Mussolini, and his goal was to try and recreate the Roman Empire. And we're going to talk about him just in a second. But to actually define fascism, this is a government system with a dictator that has absolute power. And there are three characteristics of a fascist state that I would like you to know. First of all, in a fascist state, they forcibly suppress all opposition and criticism. Okay? Forcibly suppress all opposition and criticism. There is no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press. And in fact, all these examples we'll see in both Italy, Germany, Soviet, the Soviets are communist, but still you have the same limitations on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. There is no opposition that is allowed. One of the first things Adolf Hitler does in the Night of the Long Knives is he actually goes and has his henchmen kill all of the opposition leaders. I mean, they're murdered in a single night. The newspapers are taken over by the government. There is no room for opposition or criticism in a fascist state. The second characteristic of a fascist government is that they regulate all industry and commerce. What does that mean? Well, to regulate means to control. Okay, so they are in control of all industry and commerce. So, they will dictate what factories should be making, right? So, one of the first things that Adolf Hitler does as well is he is going to force many factories in Germany to mass produce radios. Right? He knew the power of mass media. He knew the power of being able to speak to every German every single day. And so he wanted to mass produce radios in order for people to get that propaganda into their homes as easily and cheaply as possible. In fact, they made radios at a loss. They actually, they were making them and selling them for less than what it actually cost to produce because it was so important to get that message into their home. The third characteristic is an emphasis of aggressive nationalism coupled with racism. Okay, so let me say that again. Aggressive nationalism coupled with racism. So this idea that our country is the best country in the world and we can dictate what other countries do. And in the 1930s, this is going to result in countries invading other countries, Germany invading Poland and other surrounding nations. And there's always a racist element to fascism as well. There is almost always a minority that is selected as a scapegoat. And of course, most famously in Nazi Germany, that would be the Jewish people. But it was not just the Jews. Ultimately, with the Holocaust, 6 of the 11 million people that died in the Holocaust would be Jewish. But the other 5 included political opponents, communists, artists, it included priests, it included teachers, just anyone that could actually stand up and speak out against that government. But there is some racist element to it, and that's what I want to focus on right now, is that there is a group, a subgroup within their society that they pick out as being the problems of their society. Hitler blamed the Jews for all the problems of Germany. Not only in terms of infiltrating the financial systems, he said, Jews control the banks, but also politics, saying that the Jews had kind of infiltrated the Weimar Republic and had, basically twisted the German government to the point where they gave up in World War I. So fascism, I think that is perhaps the most defining feature of fascism, is this aggressive nationalism coupled with racism. That's a very important element. And again, I think if you really open your eyes and kind of look around, I think you will see, even in modern society, groups mostly don't openly call themselves fascists, but a lot of these characteristics, are still being pushed by groups today. Now let's get into an actual example, and we're going to start with the man who invented fascism, the first country to actually go through and identify as a fascist country, and that is Italy and Benito Mussolini. In 1925, Mussolini developed this idea of fascism. He had actually been a communist before, so some of those ideas on kind of total control over society, I think he kind of adapted from that, but turned it into kind of his own brand. Now Mussolini would take over the Italian government, and we won't get into the full detail of this. Next year in World History, we focus a lot more on Europe. Our goal in American is we do tend to focus more on the Pacific side, so we won't go into full detail here. But Mussolini would eventually take over. There was a king of Italy, and he literally just marched his supporters down to kind of the gates of the king and kind of strong-armed him into giving him power. And even though the king was allowed to stay there in Italy, Mussolini effectively just took control of the government by force. And one reason he was able to do that is because he had a group of followers, kind of a paramilitary force, a militia, that he used to kind of intimidate and commit acts of violence to force his will. They were called the Black Shirts, and of course, obviously not a very creative name there. They wore a black shirt uniform. But Mussolini would basically use his black shirts to attack any government operations or in any opposition. I mean, it was well known that in Rome, I mean, his black shirts would go around at night. I mean, they would beat up people that were anti-Mussolini. They would murder people. That violence and intimidation by truly a group of thugs, these militiamen, they intimidated people into giving up their rights and not for standing up what they should have. So they are really the ones that allowed Mussolini to gain power through that violence and intimidation. But we'll see that fascism takes root in Italy, but it is going to spread elsewhere. And we're going to talk about two other nations in which fascism will emerge. And, sorry, I meant to mention this picture. And let me go back really quick. If you look at that, when I was talking about fasces, that Italian, that Roman symbol of power, that bundle of sticks, I meant to show you guys this picture because that symbol, of course, has always been a symbol of power. The fascists kind of stole that symbol. They're good at stealing symbols. Same with the swastika that the Nazis will take. But look at Abraham Lincoln. Look at underneath his hands. What do you see there? Okay, yeah, you see a fasces, the bundle of sticks, that symbol of power right there in the Lincoln Memorial that you've probably seen 1,000 times and never really noticed that detail before. Again, it has nothing to do with fascism here. That would be a government, that was, a type of government founded much after the statue was formed, but just showing you that symbol of power has existed for literally thousands of years and is even used in our own symbolism in America. Now let's turn our attention to Germany, and we'll remain here for the remainder of the lecture because it is such an interesting rise to power for Adolf Hitler and the destruction of the previous German government. So I want to remind you, in World War I, of course, Germany lost that war. The government that was put into place after that war was called the Weimar Republic, and in many ways they were very similar to the American Republic. They had, they used democracy. People voted for representatives in that republic, and there were a lot of parallels to kind of the American government system. But Germany had a lot different problems than we did, in particular when it came to economics. Of course, being the loser of that war and being picked on through the Treaty of Versailles, which was a completely slanted treaty, and I kind of alluded to it at the time, but a lot of problems that led to what we're talking about now. The Weimar Republic was not at all ready to handle any of those problems, and what they had to experience in the 1920s and 30s was even what was called hyperinflation. I mean, you might walk by a cafeteria in the morning and when a cup of coffee costs $1, you walk by later that day, it might cost $100. Okay, hyperinflation. I mean, literally, the money becomes worthless. You have no, there's no ability to tell how much value currency has because inflation is just running so rampant. So the Weimar Republic is being heavily criticized in the 1920s as being kind of the root of this problem, that they're not doing anything to solve these problems. And part of that is republics and democracy. It's not efficient, and no one has ever claimed it to be. But frankly, there's actually some benefits to that, because I think the only thing more dangerous than a government not passing a bunch of laws is a government that does pass a bunch of laws. Imagine if the government was passing 100 laws every day, we wouldn't be able to even keep up, and obviously some of those wouldn't be warranted. In a democracy, you debate, you discuss, and you try to reach not only a conclusion that most people are happy with, but it allows you to explore, the positives and negatives of things. That is not efficient. That takes time, and frankly, it can get tiresome. Well, Germans are getting tired of the inefficiency of the Weimar Republic, and so they are going to turn to a radical leader who proposes that he has all the solutions to make Germany a great nation again. So. The political extremism of Adolf Hitler was very appealing to many Germans, and we're going to see him rise to power here in a second. Now, Hitler himself was actually not German. He was Austrian. He came from neighboring Austria, but he had an affinity for German culture, and he had this belief that political lines really did not define what made Germany. He believed he himself was a part of this German culture, that Germany really extended beyond the political borders. And remember, the political borders in the 1920s were political borders set up by the victors of World War I. So Hitler doesn't even recognize those borders as being legitimate. He thinks that the Treaty of Versailles was an illegal document, and so that's a major issue there. But he does develop some pretty radical ideologies after his time in the war. He will serve in World War I for Germany. And I guess before that, back up his background, he actually started out as an artist. He would paint a lot of landscape scenes, and he even applied at one point to go to art school in Paris and was rejected from that. And that's always one of those what-if moments in history I've always found to be fascinating. What if Hitler had been accepted to that art school? Could we have maybe even avoided World War II? I don't know. Some art critic instructor in Paris in the 1920s may have decided the fate of the world. You never know how our decisions are going to affect the rest of history. But after the war, well, actually during the war, while he's in the trenches, he's exposed to some pretty radical political ideas, and he's definitely one of those soldiers that is feeling betrayed at the end of World War I. Many Germans felt like they were winning the war, and next thing they know, the government is signing this peace treaty and basically signing away, basically all of Germany to the other side. So he felt betrayed, and it does radicalize him. He's exposed to some radical political ideologies, and ultimately he starts connecting with a group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And when in German, if you were to take that acronym, or shorthand, they refer to themselves as the Nazis. Okay, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, don't be confused by the socialist element of that. I always have a lot of people trying to connect that to communism. Really, all that term means here is that the Nazis believed that what policies they were going to put forward were best for German society, that they would be the ones kind of controlling, again, it's a fascist party, that they would be the ones doing what was best for society. So that's kind of what the socialists mean, not necessarily tied to the communist ideology of Karl Marx. And in fact, it's actually the exact opposite of that in some ways. So Adolf Hitler joins up with the Nazi Party. They are a brand new party, and he rises to power pretty quickly in this party. He is very outspoken, and they ask him to start speaking at some meetings, and he just has these people, in the palm of his hand. They love listening. He was a powerful speaker, and many people, of course, agreed with what he had to say. Now, the Nazis their goal, and I think that's very important, Nazi goal was to restore German national unity through fascism and racial purity. Let me say that again. The goal of the Nazi Party was to restore German national unity. Remember, they had lost a lot of their land because of the Treaty of Versailles. They want that land back. And racial purity. Again, they used Jewish people as scapegoats, saying that they are the problems of Germany, and they wanted to find a solution. And of course, sadly, once the war does begin, that final solution they come up with is to try and execute every single man, woman, and child that is of the Jewish faith. Now, this anti-Jewish sentiment is officially called anti-Semitism. Okay, and I do want you to know that term. So, anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish. This is opposition to the Jewish people and the Jewish culture. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were kind of seen as outsiders. Even though Jews had been there literally for hundreds and hundreds of years, they were still seen as outsiders in German society. Even though they were many people that, frankly, you might not even know were Jewish, but, your shop owners, people that owned stores, that, worked they were normal Germans. But yet the Nazi Party started to identify them as being kind of a plague on Germany and identifying them as a scapegoat. Now, following the cues that many other radical governments had taken before that, Hitler and the Nazi Party, by 1923, they do decide to overthrow the Weimar Republic by force. And I will give you a warning here. Anytime that your plot to overthrow a government is you come up with it in a bar, it's probably not the best plan. So the beer hall push, called that because it literally was formulated in a bar, the beer hall in Germany, and the Nazis tried to basically take over Germany by force in much the same way that Mussolini had, marching his black shirts down to the gates of Rome. That's what Hitler was going to try to do. They literally took to the streets armed, and they tried to take over a government building, but they failed. They were pushed back by police, and in fact, those that weren't killed in the shootout were actually arrested, and Adolf Hitler was among that group. Adolf Hitler will find himself in prison in 1923 for trying to overthrow the German government. Now, this is one of those strange twists of history. You might think, okay, well, now that Hitler's in prison, hey, we'll never hear from him again. Not so much. In fact, this was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to him, because while he is in prison, he has time to write, and he does so prolifically. He will write a book that he calls My Struggle, or Mein Kampf. And in this book, he outlines, it's kind of like half autobiographical, which a lot of it is not true. I mean, any autobiography you have to take with a grain of salt, but in Hitler's case, that's absolute. I mean, he portrays himself, of course, as the hero of Germany, the savior of Germany. But he does, he does kind of outline his life, and a lot of Germans did find parallels with his story. A young man struggling to find work, a young man who felt betrayed in World War I by the German government. A lot of people felt like that, and so many people start to identify with Adolf Hitler through Mein Kampf. But the anti-Semitism in Mein Kampf is very present, and even though Germans, I would truly argue that most Germans at this time are not racist, anti-Semitic people, most of them. But this is a big lesson from this unit. What Germans don't understand is that this message that they're starting to attach themselves to, even though they're getting it in small little bits, well, the Jews are the problem with this. At first they're saying, well, I don't know if I agree with that. But you hear that message over and over and over and over and over, and eventually it starts to seep in. You really do need to be careful with the things that you read and you listen to, because ultimately those kind of very radical and negative ideas do start to seep into your mentality, and it happens here. The Nazis were absolutely racist, and as they gain more power, the German people start to fall in line with that message and become more anti-Semitic themselves. the book Mein Kampf is not only anti-Semitic, but it's also anti-Bolshevik. That's a term I have not used yet. Anti-communist. Okay. The Soviet Union, of course, was one of the biggest enemies of Germany in World War I, and since World War I, they have become a communist country. Adolf Hitler also points a lot of Germany's problems on the threat of communism from their east, and even proposes that communists have infiltrated Germany. Were there communists in Germany? Sure. But I will tell you that the Nazis posed a much bigger threat to German society than the communists did at this time. But again, Hitler is trying to create kind of a boogeyman, you know, in both the Jewish people, but also the communists. They have to always have an enemy. Okay, and this is another big lesson that I frankly see today. You know, whether you know whatever group you want to refer to, but you know, keep in mind when politicians in particular are trying to identify a group as being, you know, ones that commit acts of violence or are, you know, emphasizing that they're undermining everything in society, but yet there's really no proof or evidence of that. You need to kind of wake up. But the Nazis are going to say that, you know, the communists are here, it's very anti-communist, and that they're part of the problem for Germany too. So, you know, when Hitler emerges from prison, he's a best-selling author and has all of a sudden become a national celebrity. And he actually does get out of prison fairly quickly. There was frankly, a kind of a lenient judge who had some pro-Nazi sympathies that helped Hitler get out of prison early. Well, it was not long before Hitler actually takes the stage on a national level and really becomes a very powerful figure in Germany, and that is when Hitler becomes chancellor. Now, at the time, you still had the president of Germany, Hindenburg, who was an old World War I veteran, war hero, general in that war, very old though, and he is actually looking for kind of a fresh young face to come in and serve kind of as his second in command, and what better person than Hitler? He didn't necessarily adhere to some of the more radical things that Hitler said, but man, Hitler was popular at this time. And so Hindenburg thought, man, if I bring Hitler in as chancellor, as kind of my number two, then, you know, that's going to score a lot of PR points for me. And so he does that. And one of the biggest mistakes in history. But when Hitler gains power as chancellor, his popularity, continues to grow. And he does start to gain more and more control within the government, more and more control over even Hindenburg himself. In 1933, Germany is going to withdraw from the League of Nations, and we talked about the League after World War I in the Treaty of Versailles, in which you know, this organization, the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, the American president, this idea that there would be an organization where every country in the world would send representatives to try and work out problems instead of resorting towards warfare, and that's a great idea. But there were some major problems with it. Number one, that some big countries didn't involve themselves. America wouldn't even join the League of Nations, even though it was our idea. But also, there was no teeth to it. There was no enforcement of anything, any rulings of the League of Nations. And in fact, in this situation, when Germany withdraws in 1933, there's no repercussions. Nothing happens. It's like they just walk out the door, and they're kind of allowed to do so. So, you know, now that Germany's out of the league, and by the way, Japan would follow suit very soon, which, by the way, Japan is already fighting World War II at this point. They've already invaded China in 1931. We talked about that in our first lecture. So that is happening at this same time. So when these countries leave the League of Nations, there are no repercussions, and, you know, there's nothing that the League of Nations can do besides kind of shake their fist as they walk out the door. This last point on this page I want to focus on is a big one, the Reichstag fire of 1933. One evening in 1933, February 27th, in fact, as I'm recording this, it's February 24th, so we're coming up on the anniversary here. But February 27th, 1933, there's a news flash that goes out across the radio that the capital of Germany is burning. Okay, just like our capital in Washington, D.C., big white domed capital, it was basically, it had been attacked. And again, I guess the timing of this, I'm not even trying to draw these parallels, but here they are. But basically, the Reichstag had caught fire, and it was arson. Someone had set this fire and actually started to burn the Reichstag down. Now, the Nazis had arrested a young Dutch communist, a foreigner, a communist that they said they had found in the fire, had been setting this fire, and of course they put him on trial immediately, found him guilty, of course, of all of this. And Hitler used this opportunity to convince the German people that Germany was under attack. Okay, that the communists had infiltrated our governments and were literally trying to burn it to the ground. Hitler tells the German people that he is really the only one that can save them, that the communists are here, that we are under attack, and basically he needed more power to do what needed to be done. President Hindenburg, who's quite old at this time, and in fact will be dead within the next year, he agrees with Hitler, and kind of there's a rising voice of support among German populations that Hitler can be the guy to save Germany. And so Hindenburg does issue an emergency decree which grants Hitler a number of powers to, basically violate civil rights of those in Germany, and, not requiring things like warrants and whatnot. But all of a sudden, Hitler has gained quite a bit of power because of this event. And I guess I want to take a quick time out. This is another great reminder of a major lesson that we'll see time and time again in history, and that is when there are emergencies, when there are fears, when fear is the predominating reaction to events, people give up their rights, and they violate some of the age-old laws. In Germany, they basically violate the Constitution by giving Hitler all this power, but people are afraid. He's convinced them that communists are lurking everywhere and Jews are lurking everywhere. He's the only one that can save them, and so they sign away a lot of their rights. I would argue that the same thing in America kind of happened after 9/11. Within the next month after 9/11, we signed a bill called the Patriot Act, and there were a lot of good things in the Patriot Act, but there were also some things that got abused in the long run. Guys that actually wrote the Patriot Act said years later we had no way envisioned that it would be used. For instance, the program that Edward Snowden leaked to the media, that basically the government was keeping records on every American's communication, that they were surveilling emails and phone records and keeping logs of every American's communication. That program was born out of the Patriot Act. And so again, we were so fearful in the days following 9/11 that we wanted somebody to do something to protect us. And frankly, we signed away some of our rights to privacy in that law. It's the same thing here. Germans are afraid, and they give this man power because he promises to save them. And in reality, he's going to destroy them. Now, before I leave this slide, I would like you to understand that how I presented this story is how it was presented even at the time. We know now, years later, it was discovered that the Reichstag fire had actually not been set by this young Dutch communist. Instead, it was found later on through private diaries that had been found from key Nazi members and leadership, that the Nazis themselves were actually the ones to set this fire. I'm reminded about what's happened with the Japanese very recently, where they set up that incident, the Mukden incident, to have a reason to invade China. It's the same thing here. The Japanese set that up, and here the Nazis have set this up. They're the ones that burned the Reichstag, knowing that they could instill fear in the German populace to get Hitler more and more power. And so all of a sudden, within a few short years, we have a man being arrested for trying to violently overthrow the government, but now it has become the most powerful German in the government. Because in 1934, President Hindenburg dies, and although the Constitution called for an election to be held where we would vote for a new president, Instead, Hitler declares that he is willing to basically take over both his role as chancellor, but also the role as president of Germany. And he would combine this into one great title called the Führer, or the leader. He is now the head of state. And by the way, that went to a vote of the German people, and overwhelmingly, people agreed that instead of having an election to vote for someone new, that instead Hitler should gain all of this power. Hitler is now the most powerful man, perhaps in all of Europe, but definitely in Germany. And he sets right away to violating the Treaty of Versailles. Step one, he begins rebuilding the military. In direct violation of the treaty, which said that they could maintain kind of a small police force, no air force. He begins to rebuild that secretly at first, but then it becomes known later on, but no country is willing to step in and do anything about it. He will also start instituting a series of laws that are aimed directly at the Jewish people. They are known as the Nuremberg laws. Now, you are probably familiar with some of these. You probably know that Jews in Nazi Germany were forced to wear the yellow Star of David to symbolize that they were Jewish. The idea might have been sold to the Germans, saying, hey, if they have to wear this on their clothing, if a Jew comes walking towards you, you can avoid them and whatnot. In reality, all this did was put a major target on the Jewish people, and this is where the violence is really starting to increase for the Jews. They're finding themselves just in the streets being violently attacked and killed because of that. But it wasn't just symbols that they had to wear as a part of the Nuremberg laws. That also extended to more restrictions on who they could and could not marry. Nuremberg laws, and frankly, this is what I write down for your notes. The Nuremberg laws stripped the civil and property rights of the Jewish people. They no longer could own their own private property. It was now the property of the government. It was the property of the German state. Everyone over the age of 6 had to wear a yellow Star of David. This is really the beginning of the end for the Jews in Germany. And many of them are starting to get increasingly concerned as they hear about acts of violence against Jewish people. And things are starting to get out of hand. Things will reach a crisis, critical point in November of 1938. There is a news report that goes out across Germany that a German official has been murdered by a Jewish man. And that night, the Nazi Party basically makes it known that the German people need to rise up and kind of have revenge. And so they're not, the police really aren't going to be out in force, but they basically tell the paramilitary soldiers and kind of the street thugs to attack Jewish synagogues and the homes of Jews, businesses that are owned by the Jews, and what becomes known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, or the Night of Broken Crystal. This is a singular night of massive violence towards the Jewish people in Germany. There are many Jews that are killed in this night, but even more so, many Jews find their homes and businesses burned to the ground as a result of this violence. And again, the government does nothing to prosecute individuals that were responsible. In fact, they were the ones that were responsible. For many Jewish people, this is the moment where they decide that they do have to, it's reached a critical point and they need to get out. So you have 60,000 Germans will come to the United States alone. Okay, tens of thousands will go elsewhere, trying to escape Germany before things get even more out of hand. But by 1939, and we are just a few months short of the war itself breaking out in Europe, Jews are continuing to try and leave Germany en masse. But by within that 1 year, many countries are starting to actually turn them away. And that includes the United States. In 1939, there was a ship that arrived in the New York harbor called the St. Louis. And there were about 915 German Jews that were seeking refuge from Germany. And they were denied that refuge in the United States. They did try to stop a few other countries, some in the Caribbean, and again, they were denied refuge. No one wanted to take 900 homeless Jewish people from Germany. And they forced that ship to turn around. Most of those people had nowhere else to turn, and many of them just had to return back to their home cities. about 25% of them would die in the concentration camps within a few short years. So, America, while we did accept a large number of Jewish immigrants, even America reached a point where we said enough is enough, and we don't want these people here. And many of them lost their lives even because of those policy decisions. So, it's we're reaching like I said, a critical point here where Jews are being violently attacked. Hitler is at full power, and what we're going to see next time is the beginning of war, and that is German plans to expand their borders and to recreate the Third German Empire, or as Adolf Hitler called it, the Third Reich. Guys, thank you so much for paying attention today. As always, email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer those. Hopefully you found this lecture to be interesting, and I will meet you back again, and we'll talk about the beginning of World War II in Europe. Thanks again.